Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, your RB Laws, and this is my co-host.
For Wells.
We're here with you guys for a live discussion of the games that occurred today. So we had one elimination and one Game 7 forcing situation, which is kind of what we expected. You know, we expected to see an elimination, and we definitely expected to see this other series get extended. And before we do start, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Helps us out a lot. And yeah, you guys can get more content from us. And yeah, so let's talk about these games that occurred today, because I think, tale of two cities for this one.
So I guess we might as well start off with the elimination one, I guess.
Sure.
Right. So we'll start off with Mavs Clippers. Mavs win 114-101. And the Mavs win the series, right? They won in 6. Kind of an interesting series where there was a lot going on that it was kind of hard to really gauge where it was gonna go, right? Because I think going into the series, especially with Kawhi's health in question, we kind of expected the Mavs to win.
Mhm.
And then they got destroyed in game 1. And we were just like, okay, what's going on here? This team isn't looking like how we thought they would. Um, After, the way they closed out the second half of the season, right?
Right.
And then, Kawhi comes back in game 2 and also plays in game 3, just doesn't look himself. And then the Mavs, they went out. Now, obviously, they also, won the rest of the way, right? I think they lost game 4, right? Because that was the one where the Clippers had the 30-point lead, lost it, and then, got it back and closed it out. But just such a strange, bizarre series because, I mean, you just factor in Kawhi doesn't really play except for 2 games, isn't really himself. And the Mavs still, it still takes 6 games. Obviously, there's other guys on the roster besides Kawhi. You have Harden, um, you have Paul George, right? Terrence Mann, Norman Powell, Zubac, who played really well in this series. But, at the end of the day, you needed Kawhi to win this series, right? So when you don't have him, it's kind of a tall task to win a series without your best player. But, the Mavs also kind of showed, why, the moves they made at the deadline and what they were doing towards the end of the regular season, you can still say was legit. They played great defense over the course of the series. They would get out and run, right? Their bigs started the series a little bit spotty, but got better as the series went along. Even Maxi Kleba, before he got hurt, right? He had, a couple of games and stretches where he actually played pretty well as, sort of like a stretch big, to kind of balance out what you were getting from Gafford and Lively. Luca was interesting because he wasn't really efficient in the series. He was able to pick his spots, right? And obviously he, had stretches where he was settling a little too much, but then once he was playing with pace, and just kind of attack the basket. Then they were kind of cooking, and then Kyrie in the second half, right? He obviously turned it up, right? He was basically putting up what he was doing in the regular season, but obviously on a bigger stage with this with really good efficiency. And he was kind of their closer for a lot of this series, and even defensively he played really well, right? Where he's guarding Harden or Paul George and going after rebounds and diving for loose balls, which is just kind of wild, right? Because you know if you would have said a couple seasons ago, obviously when the Nets were together with Kyrie, Harden, and Durant, if you would have said, hey, this team is going to break up, they're all going to go their separate ways, and the one that actually shows the most leadership and might actually have the deepest playoff run post Brooklyn is Kyrie, that would just be crazy, right?
Right.
Considering where he was. The Homelander says game over. Yeah. Yeah, that series was done. But yeah, I couldn't have believed it, right? Just because it looked bad, right? Where he wasn't playing. He was kind of erratic, in terms of his personality and behavior, but he turned it around and the Mavs made a huge gamble, right? Because they lost Jalen Brunson. Shouldn't have really lost Jalen Brunson, but they did. And they kind of bounced back and picked up Kyrie, who's obviously still really good, on a reasonable deal. And it also kind of shows how role players can help out in a series, right? Because this is what I wanted. Yeah, I think that makes sense. But we'll get into that. But obviously, like for the Mavs, this is why you get the role players, you know, on this team, right? Because this duo was together last year and they were losing a lot of games, right? And those guys individually were playing relatively fine, but the fit looked a lot worse because you had no real defenders out there, no real size. And now you have a more like actually legitimate playoff rotation. And so now everything kind of makes sense and works around them. Welcome to the Kyrie show. Same old Clippers. Clippers curse still lives. Yeah, I
Facts.
mean that's kind of what it's felt like, for the Clippers. I mean, again, 5 years with this group. One conference finals appearance. I think Kawhi and Paul George have only played in the playoffs together, like for since the bubble, right? I mean, how many times have they played together? Maybe like twice in the LA building,
Yeah.
right? Because I think, yeah, because I mean, like Kawhi got hurt in the Mavs series, or not the Mavs, the Jazz series. Then doesn't play for a year, right? And then obviously against the Suns had home court, I think, right? So he didn't play after game two. And then obviously he played the first two games, or game two and game three, but like still, like that's just nuts, right? In
Yeah.
5 years since the bubble, they've only played a couple of times in the LA building, and this is their last series in that building, so it's kind of fitting. But yeah, a really good display by the Mavs in terms of why this duo makes a lot of sense and why it could be really deadly in the playoffs. It still feels kind of weird that it went six without Kawhi, but that's still a credit to the other players on the Clippers roster. But the Clippers just didn't have enough. So the Mavs move on, and the Clippers, we'll see what they do in the offseason. Do they bring back Paul George and Harden? You assume they do. Or does Paul George go elsewhere? We don't know. But yeah, like it's just rough because if you're the Clippers, you're kind of forced to run it back, but it just doesn't seem like, this was kind of the year. And if you don't get it done this year, I don't see any reason to believe why it would get any better.
Yeah, and it's crazy. Like, like you said, this was supposed to be the year, and it wasn't. Plain and simple. It was another year where we're talking about, oh, well, if the Clippers had Kawhi in this series, then it'd be different. And it's like, I mean, how many more years of that are we going to really take, and how many can we handle? And that's kind of the tough decision. But like you did say, they have some decisions to make in terms of James Harden, Paul George, even Ty Lue. They're obviously going to extend Ty Lue because he's a great coach. But I think the big questions are going to probably be Paul George. And that's rough because I think, they're good players in the regular season for sure, but postseason, I think, they tend to disappear. Like even in this game, you look at Paul George, 18 points, 6 for 18, 2 for 10 from the three. And, that's box score watching, but you could really see in the game he was kind of bothered. Just really wasn't his true self. Same with Harden, 5 for 16, 0 for 6 from the three, and that's kind of what we talked about. They're just a little too inconsistent, I think, for our liking. In the postseason, and that's why you really needed Kawhi to kind of be here, be healthy, be strong, and he wasn't. And that's kind of just how the Clippers tend to operate and how they've operated for the past few years, unfortunately. So, me personally, it's like the regular season, they're great, especially when they're all together and healthy, but you already know you just can't trust any of these guys health-wise or some of them performance-wise when it comes to the postseason. That's really unfortunate for the Clippers because it's a sad way to go out. Once again, they basically just follow the same story every single season, and it's another one. And it's really tough, I think.
Yeah, and that's why again it's so hard to trust them because again, like you said, you got guys that are never really reliable in terms of their health and sometimes unreliable in terms of their performances. It's tough, and it's like now all these guys are older, so you don't even really have the I guess the advantage of saying like, oh, these guys are like 28, 29. Now all these guys are like what, 32, 33, 34.
Right.
And it's just like, are you really going to commit to all of this long term? I mean, you kind of have to, right? Because they don't really have any more picks. They don't really have a lot of young guys to really, bounce off of and kind of just say, all right, we're okay with rebuilding because we have, X, Y, and Z. You're not rebuilding with Bones Highland,
Yeah,
and
right.
and others, right?
Yeah.
Like that's just not how that's going to go. So they're kind of stuck. And so that's really the issue. Lippers, or I guess L Clippers or whatever
Yeah,
from
I
the
think,
homeland.
yeah, Lippers. That's funny.
Yeah. Yeah, and then again, like you said, that's kind of the thing where like every year they're generally in the sphere of contenders because a lot of people recognize and understand you do have a strong core of stars, right? You got guys that play both ends of the floor at a pretty high level, um, but again, you just can't trust them and you can't rely on them, right? Like I mean, again, one conference finals appearance, and that was one where Kawhi didn't even play, right? Other than that, right? In the bubble they lost in the second round, right? In seven, right? They blew the 3-1 lead, lost in the conference finals to the Suns, didn't make the playoffs the next year because both Paul George and Kawhi were not really available. And then obviously last year they lost in five to the Suns. And then this year they lose in six to the Mavs, right? Again, without Kawhi. So that's the tough part. Like, is it going to get better? It's just not. So, obviously, I guess you're going into a different arena. So, I guess that could probably change maybe what your home court stuff is. But, it's just Harden playoff failure right on schedule.
It was
Um,
inevitable.
yeah, and again, that's when you don't have Kawhi and you have to rely more on Paul George and Harden. That's what's going to happen. And that's also where you give credit to the Mavs defensively because a guy like Derek Jones Jr. Even though he's not big, right? He's long, he's athletic, but he's very skinny. He's able to guard Paul George really well because again, that's the thing with Harden and Paul George where they're not as comfortable just attacking the basket whenever they want to anymore, right? They're no longer quite as quick or as athletic as they were, um, you know, 5+ years ago, right? When
Right.
they were, upper tier players,
Yeah,
right? Like
I would
Harden
even
was
say 3 years ago, honestly. Maybe for
right.
Paul George's case, but
Yeah, and some of that's injuries and some of that's age.
right.
But again, like a guy like Derek Jones Jr. being, a like a pest for Paul George, right? Being able to use his length and athleticism to contest his shot to make it hard for him, force them into tough spots. Like the Mavs also have, the two bigs, right? That kind of force them when they get into the lane to probably try to kick out to somebody else, as opposed to them just being like, all right, I'm comfortable driving and attacking, like say Luca and Kyrie are. And that's kind of something that you have to factor in. Again, Kawhi kind of fills in the gaps, but he's not there. So, that's really the tough part. And then a guy like a PJ Washington, right, where he can, switch on a number of different guys, but he can also space the floor and shoot, right? And it's just like better players that you're putting next to Luca and Kyrie, athletic, high motor guys, which is kind of what we talked about with say like a LeBron and AD, right? The type of players that they need. Um, and those are perfect guys to put next to Luca and Kyrie, right? Because those guys, obviously they're playing faster, right? But obviously, Luca normally doesn't always play that fast. Obviously, he's played fast this year, and then Kyrie can play fast. He's just older. Um, but those are perfect guys because they run the floor, play both ends. So it looks great. Obviously, again, they're moving on to the next round against Oklahoma City. And I guess that's kind of, where we lead into, right? So obviously, that series starts Tuesday, game one in Oklahoma City. So how do we feel about that matchup? Because obviously, Oklahoma City is a different team compared to the Clippers, right? Like, it's a smaller team, but a much faster team and a much younger team. And their best player is available in SGA. Um, but they have 3 stars kind of as well. Bark, 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 bark from the Homelander. So what are we thinking about this series? Because again, like I think you can make a case for either team. Because again, you can say with the Mavs, well, should it really have gone to 6 without Kawhi? But then for Oklahoma City, you can also say this isn't Brandon Ingram, right? This is Luca and Kyrie. So what do you think about this series? Going in.
Yeah, I think it's going to be very entertaining. I don't really know right now. Like, I'm sure I'll be able to decide once I'm done talking about it. But as of right now, I don't know who's going to win, this next series. I think it's going to be an insane match for sure because I think, you have two guys in Derek Lively and Chet Holmgren that kind of match up together very well. And even like Gafford, I think, Gafford has the potential to take a guy like Chet out. But I think it really comes down to, I think J-Dub is going to have to elevate his play if he wants to really ascend because I think, the problem is if Dallas plays like how they kind of played during this series where Kyrie is playing like out of his mind, alongside Luka being, the best player on the floor, then I think OKC stands no chance. But if we're looking at OKC, I think, if J Dub can play up to par alongside a great Shea, which I think we already know they're both going to be very consistent, I could see maybe OKC in 7. That would kind of be the way that I'm kind of looking at it. But this is going to be a crazy series because I think they match up very well. It's just a matter of, I think, the star talent and the star play and how these guys are really going to match up at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think, again, both teams have advantages and disadvantages against each other, right? Because like OKC, you can say they have 3 guys that you feel relatively decent about on offense, right? Because obviously you have Shea, you have Chet, and you have Jalen Williams. So the Mavs don't really have like a consistent third guy. It's a lot of different guys, right? Like
Right.
there's a night where like PJ Washington could pop off, for 3, 4 threes or whatever. Right. You could have Derek Jones Jr., right, randomly get into double figures, or one of the bigs, could get into double figures. So that's kind of something to look at, right? Because obviously, again, the OKC doesn't have the size necessarily, but they do have the speed, I think, to probably match the pace that the Mavs want to play. And then you also have to factor in, OKC sometimes can get hot from 3 as well, right? Like it's not necessarily Shea, but the other guys, if they're on fire, can heat up. So that's kind of something to look at where, the Mavs defensively, how do they fare against some of the shooters for Oklahoma City? And then even a guy like a Lou Dort, right? Because he shot pretty well, against New Orleans, right? Can he keep it up against the Mavs? He's been shooting pretty well, on the season. So you would think, like, yeah, he's a good 3-point shooter. And then obviously defensively, can he slow down one of Luca or Kyrie? Because, it's probably going to be tough to slow down both, right? Because they've, kind of gotten pretty good at like finding ways to play off of each other and attack, right? Like, because we've seen Luca, kind of start the games in the first halves, and then the second half is more so Kyrie. Um, but I don't know, right? Because that's kind of the thing, right? Because Luca in this Clipper series, he shot pretty poorly, from the field in most of these games, right? Like especially from three, right? He was like having games where he's like 1 of 10, or like 2 for 8 or something like that. So that's kind of something to look at, right? Where and you kind of credit, the Clippers defensively, right? Because they have different guys, right? Like you could put Terrence Mann, you could put Paul George on him, for stretches, right? And obviously Zubac in the lane, right? Sometimes can be kind of a tough matchup. So I don't know. That's the tough part because if Luca, if he it just has a more efficient series, then like you said, that's where it probably has to lean towards Dallas because again, if he gets it going, I mean, you don't really have much that you can do, and he's a tough shot maker because he can
Yeah.
make he can make shots where for other players, like that's the shot you want them to take, right? Like the step back contested threes, or the tough floaters in the lane, or the mid range turnarounds, right? Like those type of shots are shots that you would want to give to other guys, but for him, he can make those in his sleep. So if he kind of just all of a sudden just starts finding a shot, and maybe it's tied to his knee, I don't know, then that's kind of tough. So I think for Oklahoma City, it's going to have to be a very much a collective effort. Um, and I think you're going to probably need to get even better performances from some of the guys in the first round. Dort is going to shut that down. I
That's
mean,
a lot of
we'll see.
confidence. I think he's going to make it tough for him, but
Yeah,
I don't know if he's going to. I think shutting him down is a crazy statement. I think he will be able to limit him and hinder him, definitely make him uncomfortable, just like how he did with Brandon Ingram. But by no means necessary are we talking like shutting him down. That's just me though, personally. I don't think Dort is a great defender, but I just think Luka is going to get his regardless. Like, you know what I mean?
so the one thing that would concern me is that those guys can draw a lot of fouls, right? Like especially like Luca. So that's the one thing that would kind of concern me at times, where it's like Dort could play great defense, but then like Luca kind of does something where he can kind of draw a foul. We know he's a crafty guy. I'm not saying he's a grifter, but like you know what I mean? Like just from the perspective of like those guys can get free throws. And those are the main guys that are gonna get free throws for Dallas anyways, right?
Yeah, they
Like
know how to
Derek
sell the
Jones.
calls.
Right. So that's something to think about. And they're gonna have to slow down those lobs, right? Because that's kind of another thing that kind of breaks, your defense in a way. Because like you could play great defense, and then all of a sudden, they can get these free lobs in the paint. Are coaches better? I think that's true. I think that's
100%.
definitely true. Um,
Agreed. I think
100.
that's a huge advantage that you guys definitely have. It'll work out, I think, in your favor. That's why I picked you guys to go and win it in 7 games. I'm thinking that it's going to be OKC 4-3. The young guns have taken
Yeah,
over the league. Ant-Man, Joker, SGA, Doncic, Halliburton. Yeah, for sure.
yeah, that's
Change of the
right.
guard.
Because that's kind of something you got to factor in, right? Because like you factor in what LeBron, Steph, Kawhi, Harden, Paul George. I mean, who else are we leaving
KD.
out? I mean, like AD, yeah, AD, I guess.
No, I was
Durant,
saying KD.
yeah, oh yeah, okay. So Durant.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
everybody,
AD
right?
too, I
Like,
guess. Yeah.
yeah, they're all toast right now, right? Like their seasons are over. Whereas this time around, you got these other guys, coming in. Even Giannis, his season is done. Um,
Right.
So, and I guess you can say his was due to injury, but like still, like just in general, that's kind of definitely something we're seeing this season, and I think that's the tough part because, like, you know, look at all the teams that have advanced in the playoffs so far. I guess right, other than I guess Dallas and Indiana, right? Most of them are the higher seeds, and they won a lot of games in the regular season because they were more consistent, right? Like that's
Yeah.
something you have to factor in. Right? Consistency is really important, and a team like Oklahoma City has been consistent all year. They've been healthy, for the most part. They didn't really make any significant trades. I mean, I guess they are going to probably clear up cap by getting Gordon Hayward, but he hasn't really done much for them. So I think this is going to be, if they win the series, that home court is obviously a huge advantage, where they're going to have to win all their home games. And then also, like, the role players are going to have to step up. Like, I think you're going to need like a bigger series from at least a couple of role guys, right? Like, I think, by committee, you're going to probably need Giddy to play, pretty well, or at the very least, like a guy like a Cason Wallace has to come in and be like, I'm going to slow down Kyrie, and at least make it tough on him, right? And then even like a guy like a Chet Holmgren, he's going to have to step up. Obviously he was really good in the series, but it's a different matchup, right? Like, he's not playing post scorers. He's playing, like more athletic type big. Gafford is a physical guy like Valanciunas, but obviously a much better athlete. And then Lively, is just, he's a pure athletic big, right? He's not very physical, but he's very long, and agile. So that's going to be something interesting to look at as well. And OKC is going to have to be prepared because, they mentioned it in the broadcast, right? With the short rolls that Gafford and Lively can do, where, they get the ball off the pick and roll and then they can make a quick pass to the corners, or somewhere else for, open shots. So that's something that OKC is going to have to look out for, right? Because I think there's certain guys that maybe you might be okay giving up open shots to, right? Like, maybe like test and see, like, what does Derek Jones Jr. do as a shooter, or other guys like that. But obviously you can't really leave Kyrie or Luka on an island, right? Because that's the tough part. But then it's tough because it's like, do you want to double them and give up wide open shots? No, not necessarily.
Right.
So I think it's going to have to be something where OKC is going to probably have to have Chet be the main guy around the basket, and then have everybody else use their speed, to kind of force the Mavs to play really fast. Because again, the Mavs want to play at a faster pace, but Luka likes to play at his own pace, right? So I think if you kind of force them into doing something else, that's where OKC might have an advantage. But I don't know, because again, like, I wouldn't really call Dallas a super deep team either. I mean, like, they do have a lot of role players, but after Luka and Kyrie, it kind of, there's a drop off a little bit. So that's where I think, like you said, if you get Jalen Williams all of a sudden, that, and he plays like at a level that's kind of close, which is a lot to ask. But like, let's say Shea and Doncic are like 1 and 2, right? Whichever, right? You assume Doncic is probably 1, and then Shea is 2. Well, after that, you probably need either Jalen Williams or Chet to be 3, which I think that's where the task becomes really difficult, because
Yeah.
that means you're going to ask one of those guys to outplay Kyrie, who's just been incredible on both ends of the floor. Um, but if he can at least get close, then maybe you can say some of that production offsets, and then you need the role players. I just don't know, because we only saw one regular season matchup. Um, Dallas smashed them. But then the second matchup, right? I don't think any of the Mavs starters played, right? So then OKC beat them by like 50,000 or whatever. But as we've seen, regular season doesn't necessarily matter quite as much in the playoffs, right? It's about adjustments. It's about certain performances. The Homelander, P. Giddy, is going to have a huge series. Um,
That's
yeah,
a
that's
crazy
gonna be,
nickname, man.
yeah, that's gonna be key, because again, he's a guy that the Mavs are probably gonna sell out on, right? Where they're gonna leave him open. They're gonna dare him to shoot. If he can knock them down, and that's gonna allow him to consistently get more minutes. And if he gets, more minutes, he can help out on the boards. He can act as a secondary playmaker. You do have some other guards, like we mentioned, Cason Wallace, Isaiah Joe. So if he doesn't play well, those guys will probably play more. And those guys are different players, right? So they can help out as well. So it's going to be by committee, because again, the only thing that would kind of concern me would be the second unit, where it's like, okay, Chet's not on the floor, but like, you might have Derek Lively out there, right? Or somebody else like that. That's one thing that kind of concerns me. I'm also curious if the Mavs even go back to Tim Hardaway Jr., because I know he was hurt, and I don't know if there's a timetable for him, but it's interesting because it's given more minutes to, say, like a Josh Green, who doesn't have the same offensive explosiveness as Hardaway, but he's a lot better defensively and just a better athlete. So I think he kind of fits maybe a little bit more what they want to do. Um, it's just a concern, right? Because I think the stretches where Dallas just kind of stopped scoring, right? It didn't matter because the Clippers obviously had some issues offensively as well.
Yeah.
That's something where, like, you might miss a Tim Hardaway Jr. for stretches, where it's like, yeah, you might need a guy that can just all of a sudden come in and just hit some threes, like an Isaiah Joe or somebody like that. So, like you said, If OKC wins the series, I think it's probably more likely that it's in 7 because I just feel like it's going to be a tall task to like beat this Mavs team like in 4 or 5 because it's not New Orleans. It's a
Yeah,
better team than New Orleans that has their best players relatively healthy. So, but again, for Oklahoma City, I think the fact that you got that experience in the first round is huge because it doesn't matter who you play as long as you go in there, and show you belong and compete, and get better each game. That's where it helps. So the Homelander predicts OKC in 6. So
fair. I'm gonna go 7 though. That's how I feel. I think in all reality, I think Oklahoma City has the edge. Because I think that as good as Gafford and Lively have been, I think they're gonna get tested very hard when they do come across Shea. I think that's gonna be a difficult task for them. But at the end of the
as
day,
well.
yeah, exactly. Like, he draws a lot of fouls. Like it's borderline Embiidish. Sergeant PG said he wasn't built to be a number one option loser mentality. I mean, that in my opinion, it's kind of hard to comment on that. I don't even know. Like, I mean, I could probably search up the Clippers going out sad. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
bad, bro. Like, we talked
it's
about it
bad.
a little bit earlier. Like, this is probably the worst case scenario because if you really think about it, at the end of the day, this is probably what the 4th or 5th time that we've seen this in a row, pretty much, where guys just aren't healthy, and then other guys don't really show up, especially when you need them the most. Because at times they stepped up, and filled the shoes of Kawhi, i.e. James Harden. At times when he was out, but when you needed him most, he vanished. Like it doesn't make sense. I don't know what's going on. These guys, they turn inefficient. They try to force stuff. They brick. But, they
Yeah,
just simply got outplayed. I'm not going to say
right.
outcoached, but definitely outplayed. And like you said, going out sad. That's probably the worst case scenario for them.
Yeah, because again, I think the tough part is again, without Kawhi, you're asking Paul George and Harden to outplay Luca and Kyrie, which is
Right.
just that's a better duo. But again, it's like you didn't even get a super efficient Luca for most of this series. So that's where like if he had, shot 50 from the field and like 40 from three, like he was doing in the regular season, it could have been 5. Or something like that. But like you said, um, Sergio, it's tough because
Yeah.
it's like,
Where'd you see that
I
quote,
mean,
by the way, dude? I just want to make sure like it's like valid.
yeah, I mean yeah, because I mean, he isn't a number one option. I think which is obvious, right? But I don't think he was. Yeah, PG is clearly not a number 1 or number 2. Um, I think it's Harden outplayed PG. Yeah, I mean, like
Throughout the series, yeah.
I mean, it's kind of tough. I think he definitely can't be a number 1. I think as a number 2, I think it really depends on who the number 1 is. I think like if the number 1 is a guy like Kawhi, okay, maybe that's not that bad.
Yeah.
But if the number 1 is somebody else, i.e., Paul George's number 1 or Harden's number 1, that's where it just doesn't work because there's just like a ceiling to how good can your team really be, um, if certain guys are your best options, and that's kind of what we're seeing around the league where it's like there are certain guys where it's like they just can't be the number 1 on a team, and then there's other guys where it's like okay they can't be a number 1 but they can be a very good number 2, right? Like we know Kyrie can't really be a number 1, if you want to be like a championship contender, but he obviously can be a great number 2,
Yeah.
if he's locked in, and if he's focused, because we saw him do it before. And we saw him do it this time around. Round 2 winners: Wolves, Celts, Knicks, OKC.
That's a little
Um,
bold.
the only one that I like that I really disagree. Well, not I don't know if "really" is the right word, but the main one that I feel like I disagree with is Minnesota. Just search Sports Illustrated.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank
I
you.
mean, I feel like that's something that I think he's definitely said before. Um,
I just wanted to
because
see it.
yeah, but yeah, round 2 winners, Wolves, Celtics. I don't know. Like Minnesota definitely has a chance. It just really comes down to, how does Edwards do, right? Like, is he close to how well Jokic plays? Because I don't think he's going to be necessarily the best player in the series. He might. If he is, they're going to win. Unless the other guys for Minnesota implode. I think the real question is Minnesota's offense. How does it look against the Nuggets? Because we know Minnesota probably will be able to defend pretty well, but will they be able to match what the Nuggets can do? Because we know Minnesota's offense has been kind of weird. It looked really good against the Suns, and part of that is because of how great Edwards was. But the Suns aren't the Nuggets, so I think that's the other thing you have to factor in as well.
Yeah.
Because the Nuggets, I think, defensively will make it tougher than Phoenix because they have more size, they have more connectivity. But then it's like, who's the guy that really guards Edwards in the starting lineup for the Nuggets? KCP, I guess. But, he's kind of a lighter-ish type guard. He's not really like a big physical guy. He's athletic, and he's got length. But I don't know if he's strong enough to deal with Edwards. But I think it really comes down to like how does Towns play, right? Gobert, can he slow down Jokic at all? Like if he can do it a little bit, because you're not necessarily completely taking him out, but can you make it tough? Because I think that's the other thing. You don't have an AD for Minnesota where it's a guy that can kind of attack Jokic relentlessly. I guess you could say Edwards could do it as a guard, but it's going to look different. Paul George, Kawhi is number one, and I'm number two. I mean, I guess to be fair, if he thought he was a number one, he'd be lying. I mean, I guess
At this point in his career.
At this point in his career, because for Indiana he was really good. We saw him play very well.
Yeah, he was number one there.
But that was also a decade ago. So that's kind of, post leg injury and other, injuries as well.
Yes.
So that's the tough part. He's no longer a guy that can really be a number one. And then as a number two, yeah, he can be good, but like you said, he's inconsistent at times, right? Where it's like there's going to be games where he's just not going to show up. And it's kind of hard, if you're really relying on him, but that's why you get a guy like Harden so that way, okay, there's no way that all three guys play bad, right? Like that's kind of, why you trade for a guy like Harden so that way, if Paul George plays bad, you hope Harden has a good game. And if Harden plays bad, you hope Paul George has a good game. Game time, according to the Homelander.
What do you think? What does that mean?
I don't know.
Okay. I mean, if he's referring to the season, or is he referring to the next series, or what?
He's referring to the next series. I think he's referring to the next series. So that's kind of something, but that's something to think about because I just think, the only one that I would probably disagree with is Minnesota. I mean, like the Knicks, they have 7 guys, but I think we're leaning towards Indiana right now. Ant-Man becomes Goliath. Okay.
I mean that's valid. I think he's on his way.
But I think the issue is there's a world where he plays great and they still don't win because the Nuggets might just be better, right? I think that's the ball game. Oh my goodness.
Okay. We was talking about the Paul George thing. Oh my God. Wait, Sergio, what team are you a fan of? Just curious. We kind of like to know what our viewers and subscribers, what team they support, just so we can kind of cater our conversations more towards the people in the chat.
Right. Yeah, but I think that's the thing is that Ant-Man could be great. They could still lose, right? Because again, if Towns doesn't show up, if Gobert gets into foul trouble, we just don't know. But there's definitely a way for Minnesota to do it. It's just again, their offense is going to have to come through like it did against the Suns because if it doesn't, then they're not going to win. And I think if they want to win, they need to steal one of the first 2 games. I think if they don't win, not that they can't win the series if they lose the first 2, but I think it becomes increasingly less likely.
Homelander's got the funniest emojis of all time.
But moving on, I guess, what do we think about, obviously the Cleveland-Orlando game? This was what we expected, right? We expected Orlando to win in game 6 at home. And it goes to a game 7 where it's anybody's guess. I think the rough part for the Cavs is that it just feels like the injuries and fatigue is starting to pile up, right? Like Jarrett Allen was already out. He has a rib injury. And then in the game, Donovan Mitchell, he scored 50, but he did get hurt. And the rough part was nobody else came along with him for the ride, mainly in the second half. I believe he scored every single point for the Cavs in the fourth quarter. And they had a lead at one point, but they just didn't get enough help from anyone else, right? Like Mobley had 5 blocks, so good defense, I guess, but goodness, he was so awful offensively.
Yeah, it was really bad.
Garland had a good stretch in the first half, but then in the second half kind of faded away. And then they got basically nothing from any of their bench guys. And I think that's kind of the rough part where, again, without Jarrett Allen, he was actually really good in the series. You just don't have as much of an interior presence. Garland and Mitchell kind of tried to make up for it because it's like, all right, now we only have one big. We have more shooters so we can attack. And that's kind of the issue with having Mobley and Allen out there. So it's like, does he even really solve it? but it just takes away another player that you could go to. Um, and if Mobley doesn't really give you anything on offense, I mean, you don't have a shot. Especially when the Magic's defense was pretty good. And then their guys made some tough shots, right? Because we knew Franz Wagner would have a bounce back game. 1 of 5 from three, but again, still at 26 points, 5 rebounds. Made all 11 free throws, which is crazy. And Paolo, right, had a really good game as well, especially in the fourth quarter when the offense was kind of starting to bog down and they needed somebody, to kind of close it out. And Jalen Suggs, right, he was great too. 22 points, 6 of 13 from three. Obviously played great defense, on Cleveland's guards or whatever. But just in general, um, the Magic played really well. So I think, we'll see what happens in game 7. None of the home teams have lost. But if the Magic win, that means that the Cavs will have lost at home. And it's starting to feel like that's probably what's going to happen because it just seems like the Cavs just seem kind of just cooked. Like they're just not really getting anything out of their supporting cast. Mitchell's played great, but it just seems like he probably just doesn't have enough help. And if the Magic offense just remotely shows up and has a pulse in Cleveland, they're probably going to end it and move on to the second round to face the Celtics. But either way, I don't think, either of those teams are beating Boston. Cleveland is overrated. Um, I think it's interesting, right? Because last year they had a really good regular season, and then came up short in the playoffs, right? And then I think the hope for most people was, okay, like Jared Allen said, the lights were brighter than expected. So you hope that you'd bounce back. This second time around, you're not playing the Knicks, you're playing the Magic, who have even less playoff experience than you, right? I think they have one guy over 30, and that's Joe Ingles, who's more of a rotational bench guy at this point.
Right.
Uh, and obviously, it looked like through the first 2 games, Cleveland played really well. Then they sucked on the road against the Magic. Um, and then, they defended home court in game 5. Then game 6 goes the way it goes. So we just don't know. I think the fact that it goes 7 makes a lot of sense. It feels like these two teams are pretty evenly matched. I think if you're Orlando, you got to feel great because, again, it looked like the Cavs might actually steal the game in Orlando because they were up early in the fourth. And then the Magic's guys just, they came through and it just felt like the Cavs just don't have enough. And that, again, pressure is going to mount. And then you're going to ask a lot of questions from Cleveland, like, what do you do? Because we know Donovan Mitchell. We know there's a world where, obviously they go out in the first round and he decides to ask out and goes elsewhere because what's the ceiling for this team, right? Because it's back-to-back first-round exits.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly not good enough, I don't think, to get out of the East.
Yeah.
So it's starting to feel, and again, he's played very well. It's not like he's quit on the team and it's just like, I've already, mapped out where I'm going, Cancun or elsewhere.
Right.
He's been basically the lifeline, and that's the worst part is you got a great game out of him and you still lost.
Yeah,
So,
50 points and a loss is insane. That's a crime.
So against a team that it doesn't feel like you should be, losing to, but the Magic seem like they might just be better, especially with the Cavs injuries. And so now they're probably going to lose. And then, we'll see what happens, for Cleveland. Do they trade Mitchell elsewhere? Does he ask out? We just don't know because, he's got, I think, another year or so left on his contract.
Mm-hmm.
And we assume he's not going to sign an extension because, again, like, it doesn't really feel like this team's going to get much better. So, the Homelander, I think, kind of makes a point where, because again, most people picked the Cavs to beat the Knicks last year, and they disappointed, right? They got wiped off the floor in that series.
We got baited hard. That was bad.
Right. So, and I think that's the problem. It does feel like it's a regular season team. And if that's the case, Mitchell probably is going to look elsewhere. But obviously, we'll get there when we get there.
Yeah.
But it definitely feels like Orlando's got the upper hand now.
Yeah.
That was a huge win, right? You're down at home in the fourth. It's anybody's game. Mitchell is destroying you, not even really from the perimeter as much, mainly from the paint, right? A 6'3", a 6'3" guard. But then again, your stars came through. Your young stars showed up and balled out. So now they got to finish the job in Cleveland.
Yeah, and it's like, when you look at Orlando, they're dangerously and very quietly deep, I think. You get a lot from a lot of these guys. It's just a matter of consistency, I think, because I think a guy like Cole Anthony, he's one of the better bench players in the league. It's just a matter of consistency. And he hasn't really shown up in the playoffs too much, but in this game, he for sure showed up. And like you were talking about, if you look at the bench for Cleveland, it's pretty bad. Isaac Okoro kind of scared to shoot threes, not really taking them in the corner wide open. Granted, he's not a great shooter. Niang, that's kind of like a guy where it's like, sometimes you wonder, why is he on the court at times? I get it. He's like an instigator. Sometimes you need those guys. But, Orlando, they get meaningful minutes out of all their guys. Like, probably the only guy who didn't do anything in his minutes was Joe Ingles, because I think he only played about 8 of them. And the plays that I saw him in, he wasn't really a factor or anything like that. But even like a guy like Fultz, like, his bench points were huge, creating something out of nothing. Wagner, out there on the boards, things like that. And then, you look around at the starters, they're just so good at defense. They know what they're doing. Obviously, it's kind of hard to make a case that you're good at defense when you give up 50 points to somebody. But, you limited everybody else. You took Mobley completely out of the game. That guy looks horrible on offense. I don't know what kind of regression that was, but he's like 7 feet blowing wide open layups at the rim. And I get it. Sometimes it's tough when you have length bothering you, like Jonathan Isaac, Carter Jr. Yeah.
And he's not.
Yeah, he's very, very, very slight. He has a slight build. And I think that's kind of a problem if you really look at it. Because I think if you take probably, I guess, Jared Allen and substitute him in for Evan Mobley, hypothetically, in this situation, Cleveland probably wins this game, if we're being real. Because Evan Mobley just doesn't really bring too much on offense. Defensively, he's a menace. Like, we already know this guy's like a former DPOY, candidate, and he showed that in this game with the 5 blocks. But if you're only out there for your defense and you're a big, it's limited. There's only a limited amount of things that you can possibly do, especially against a team like Orlando, where they've got a guy like Paolo, they've got creators, Wagner. And even some guys like Suggs, like this guy went off tonight, 6 for 13 from the 3. It's crazy.
Right. Gary Harris doesn't play.
Right.
But we'll just slide Franz Wagner, who's 6'10", over to shooting guard, and then put Jonathan Isaac in at small forward.
Yeah.
Paolo at the 4, and Wendell Carter Jr. at the 5.
They're all like 6'9" and 6'10".
Yeah, it's like the best 3-point shooters in the in that starting 5 is like the point guard in the center.
Right.
Aside from when he's getting it going. So that's
right.
kind of the crazy part, is that they have a lot more versatility with their big lineups. Because with the Cavs, it's just hard to fit Mobley and Allen together. Right? It looked good in the first 2 games because Mobley was able to stretch the floor, while also kind of taking advantage of certain matchups on the interior. But with him being the lone center, it's just kind of rough. But at the same time,
he got bullied this game, bro. That was bad.
Yeah, the previous game was fine, but this game,
sure,
not so great. That's the problem, is it just feels like where we thought the Magic would have some issues on offense, it feels like now Cleveland has a lot of issues offensively, because now with Mobley basically being taken out of the game, Strus was okay, but you just didn't have enough. So are those guys going to show up in Game 7? You hope at home, right, you get something. Does Jared Allen come back? We don't know. Does Marcus Morris Sr. start? We don't know. I mean, they made the adjustment of having him come off the bench in Game 5, but then now he starts in Game 6, which is just kind of weird. But I don't know. At the end of the day, it's just tough because you just, you can't really do much, especially when certain guys that you need to produce aren't giving you enough. And now you can kind of see, like, yeah, the Magic are probably going to win this series. We'll see. They could lay an egg on the road because, again,
wouldn't surprise me.
None of these teams have won a road game yet in the series. But then it's like, we'll see. If you're the Celtics, I feel like you probably would prefer to play Cleveland
100%,
as opposed to Orlando. Even though Cleveland, you would probably say, is the best player. The Magic, it just feels like, have a much deeper team, and they have so much more like effective size on both ends of the floor that, it might be tough. Again, we're not saying Boston's going to lose. They're going to, both teams are probably going to be worm food for the Celtics. But,
yeah,
I think if you're Boston, I feel like you probably have an easier time playing Cleveland, especially again, like there are other guys for the Cavs that aren't available, right? Like a Dean Wade would kind of be another athletic forward with size you could put out there. He's just, he's obviously not available because of injuries and others. But yeah, and obviously we'll talk about whichever team whenever they lose. But
yeah, when we get there.
Pretty rough way to pretty rough way to lose if you're Cleveland, because it felt like initially that the Cavs might actually pull it out,
Yeah.
and move on to the second round. And then the fourth quarter happened, and it was just all Donovan Mitchell and nobody else, which again, not really his fault. It's just kind of how it goes.
Yeah, and I mean, he had the hot hand. I don't blame him for doing that, and it was working. He's keeping them alive pretty much. And just getting to the rack pretty much uncontested, which is, I think a huge skill that he has for sure. But the thing with Orlando is like, they played team basketball down the stretch. They were doing a bunch on defense, getting stops. Not even like forcing any bad shots, I thought. They were kind of just taking what the defense was giving them in the case of Jalen Suggs, where he's, wide open on the 3-point line. And it's funny, he would have had even more threes if, he didn't get called for offensive fouls for kicking his leg out for a couple of those, which is kind of crazy to think about. But, I think you have to love what Orlando's been doing. And like you said, if you're Boston, you definitely want to play Cleveland because I think you can easily exploit a guy like, Donovan Mitchell, Darius Garland, even Strus, I think, compared to Jalen Suggs, Wagner, Banchero, like you can't really exploit those guys. I think on the defensive end, you can kind of rely on them to be a little spotty offensively, but defensively, like they're going to like give you a challenge, which I think Boston should try and avoid at all costs because I think Cleveland, they don't really have a lot of challengers, I think, especially in that guard space. I think that's kind of rough. Defensively, and you can kind of see it right now. Like, you're just looking around, and like you talked about, Franz Wagner at the 2, look, he puts up 26 points. Wasn't the prettiest, but still got the job done. And a Jalen Suggs at the point guard, 22 points on great shooting. So, like I said, team basketball. And another thing Orlando does great, they don't allow Cleveland to shoot a lot of open threes, which is amazing. They kind of force them to go to the paint, which is exactly what you kind of want to do, because if you're able to make more threes than the other team, you're probably going to be able to win the game.
Yeah, and like a lot of the drives that Mitchell and Garland were getting, they were tough finishes. So like you said,
Yeah.
it's the shots that you want to give up because you don't want to give up open threes. And they weren't even giving up the drives because again, they're a big team. So you kind of want to chase them off the 3-point line and kind of force them into trying to drive into the paint. You give credit to those guys because they made some absolutely tough finishes around the rim.
Yeah.
But like you said, you look at the 3-point shooting and they were 7 for 28. And Orlando wasn't amazing, right? But they did shoot 11 for 36, right? So you're talking about a difference of about 12 points,
Yep.
right? In a game that you lost by 7. So you're talking about, if the Cavs hit like, 2 or 3, they might win the game because some of those misses ended up leading to transition baskets for Orlando as well. Defense leads to offense. So
Yeah.
that's the rough part because for the Cavs, the thought process for them is that, okay, we know that the two bigs don't fit great together on offense, but we have more perimeter shooting. But it hasn't really shown up in this series. So
Yeah.
that's kind of the problem, right? Because if they're shooting the 3-ball well, then that probably is enough to get them over the hump against Orlando. But with the way that Orlando's taken away the 3, and we know some of the other guys aside from Garland and Mitchell can't really, they're not going to do a whole lot around the basket. Aside, like Strus had a few finishes, but like just in general, like, you probably prefer, if you're the Cavs, him, shooting open threes. But when they're not falling, brutal. So, and, even a guy like a Georges Niang, 1 of 4, right? Darius Garland, 1 of 4. Even Donovan Mitchell, 3 for 9, right? And he had the bomb 3 that he made at the end of the game when it was basically over. So he was really 2 for 8.
Mm-hmm.
Marcus Morris, 0 for 4. So, that's or Coro, like you said, was 0 for 2.
Yeah.
And then quickly started, settling and, not even really looking to shoot at all. So that's kind of the tough part. So, but that's what the Magic do to you on defense. So you give a lot of credit to them. Like I said, it feels like they're going to take this series now. But again, would it shock us if they laid an egg in Cleveland? No, but I feel like, with the Cavs, it feels like fatigue is also probably setting in too.
Yeah.
But we'll see.
And this is a huge momentum shifter. But looking around, I mean, I think we've covered all the bases for that happened for today, correct?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we got some new second round matchups, as we already mentioned. We got Cavs, not Cavs, OKC, Dallas,
Yeah.
Knicks, Pacers, Nuggets, Wolves, and then obviously we're waiting to see the winner of Cleveland, Orlando. They will
Yes,
play
sir.
Boston. So we're almost on the way to the second round, which is going to be interesting. I guess we also had, a coach firing as well.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
You want to talk
Obviously,
about that?
Yeah, I mean, Darvin Ham was fired, or I guess dismissed was the term
Yeah.
they used. a lot of stuff, right? They had some articles going around, right, where they were talking about, how in the offseason, right, the plan was to roll with the guys that took them there last year to the conference finals, and then he kind of went away from it, right? Like you mentioned. And as we mentioned before, right, starting Torian Prince over Rui, Cam Reddish, right, starting over guys like D'Lo and Austin, and other stuff, right? When they started changing the lineups around, seemed like he lost the team. A lot of other complaints as well, right? In terms of just not a lot of direction, right? Like there were reports that at times it felt like the players were sort of coaching themselves, which is interesting. Again, it's not all on the coaching because I think the personnel was kind of flawed. Some guys didn't play well. Roster wasn't put together as well as I think we would have thought, which is another issue as well, right? And that's kind of the problem where it's like, okay, you got rid of the coach, but do you really trust that the front office is really going to be able to, get through this spot, right? Like they mentioned names like Mike Budenholzer. Great. That was the guy that basically, kind of was a teacher for Darvin Ham. So it's like you're gonna get the originator. Like, no, no thanks.
Yeah.
The Atkinson, I'm not personally a huge fan of his. I think he's
Really?
okay, but like, yeah, I don't really think he's that great.
Hmm.
Like
I guess he
he
works
was
better with younger teams.
yeah, like exactly. And it's like that's the guy that you're gonna have coach LeBron and AD.
Right.
Okay. DJ Redick, okay, so you hired a first time head coach in Darvin Ham. Now you're gonna hire another first time head coach, except he has no prior coaching experience.
Yeah,
Ham
maybe
was
his
an
little league for his kids, but that's about it.
right, like Ham was the lead assistant for a championship team,
Sure.
whereas Redick doesn't have any. And then the other one was Ty Lue, but it's like he's coaching right now, or I guess he's done coaching for the season. But like, okay, is he actually going to go anywhere? Like,
No,
I
they're
don't
gonna
know. I
extend
mean,
him.
and if that's the case, why didn't you just hire him 5 years ago, right? Like, I mean, they could have easily have done that, and then lowballed him, and then he took, he stayed in LA for the Clippers as the assistant, and then got promoted to the head coach. So, just I don't know, the process just seems kind of bad. So I think that's kind of the issue where it's like, do you really trust that they're going to be able to hire the right head coach for the team? I mean, you would assume it needs to be a guy that LeBron and AD respect, but that was kind of the thought process with Ham, right? Is that he was a former player and an assistant coach that a lot of people really liked and trusted and respected. And then that didn't work out. So, is it going to work out again? We'll see. But yeah, not a lot of names that I really love from that list personally.
Yeah, it's a wild debacle, but like of those guys, which one would you be the happiest with? I know it's slim pickings, I guess, to some.
Yeah, because
But I
I
would
think
probably say Kenny.
I just don't think the Ty Lue one is realistic. I don't
No,
even know why that was even put out there.
no,
It's
it's not happening.
like, like that was just nuts. I mean, like, like the Clippers, I just don't think are going to do that. They're not going to be like, hey, let's help out the Lakers and fire Ty Lue and give him like, no, that's not going to happen.
Right.
So I don't know. Honestly, if it were me, keep looking, please. Like, just keep
Really?
looking. Yeah, I just don't really like any of those other options. I mean, like,
Okay.
if Kenny Atkinson was that good, he would have already had a job elsewhere.
Okay. I mean, he was what,
Like,
an assistant coach for the Warriors for the past couple of years, right?
yeah, and he was supposed to take the offer to coach Charlotte, but then he didn't. He was
Right.
like, I'd rather stay an assistant for Charlotte. It's like, okay, I get it because it's Charlotte, but
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah, it's wild. I think the Lakers are in shambles in terms of their coaching staff, and I think that's something that definitely needs to be
Yeah,
addressed.
they fired the whole staff as well. It wasn't just Ham. Like
Yeah,
Andy's gone,
yeah,
and whoever else was there is also gone too. So
yeah,
it's a whole drought.
yeah. Which is kind of odd, I think. But at the same time, it's not the first time we've seen entire coaching regimes get pretty much the boot. But when you do get coaching changes, I think it is rough, and it is kind of
You need
it take,
stability.
yeah, it takes some time to really adjust. I think more than people realize, because if you're kind of just rotating coaches in and out, it's kind of creates a sense of discomfort, I think, and a lack of, I don't know, continuity. I guess that's the word. You want to kind of be able to fit and learn and grow in a system versus like changing the system every single season, which is kind of what has happened with the Lakers at this point. But like you said, hey, I mean, I think they said David Adelman and Micah Norris are also potential candidates. I'm not even sure who those guys are, but
David, the son of Rick Adelman.
Oh,
And
okay.
yeah, he's the son of Rick Adelman. think he's on the Nuggets staff, if I'm not mistaken. So he's the
Okay.
guy that's been in high regard. But if I'm going to be honest, I don't know quite as much about like, the best assistant coaches. I've heard the names, but
Sure.
you know, those tier guys I'm not quite as familiar with. But I've heard he's, done some really good work. I mean, look at the Nuggets. I mean, they've been doing pretty good. So
Yeah, it's tough, but at the end of the day, they're going to make the decision, and I think they'll probably end up making a good one because I don't think they're going to miss 3 times because this is pretty much their 3rd strike, I think. They're on strike 3, coming up on it. But anyways, I think we've covered all the bases in terms of news, all the games that happened today. So we appreciate everybody who did show up and show out in the live stream. Thank you, Keith Wells, for all the comments. Thank you, Sergio Mendoza, for the comments. I don't think we've ever seen you in here, so thank you for being a first-time viewer. And obviously, the Homelander, always the MVP of every single chat. And once again, we appreciate all of you guys coming through here. We may or may not have a live stream tomorrow, depending on some things. I have some personal things that I do need to potentially take care of, so we'll kind of just put the noti out if we are doing it, and if we're not, that kind of means that I have the personal thing that I do need to take care of tomorrow. But regardless, it'll be a fun opener between Minnesota and Denver. I think it's going to be a wild game, wild series in general. We already talked about that and previewed a little bit. What was you going to say?
who do we think takes game 1?
Game 1? It's in Denver, right? Yeah. Ooh, I'm going to say Minnesota, just because I think they're a little bit more well-rested. Rob P is the problem. Some GMs do not like him. That's what we've heard. That's what we've heard. Yeah. I mean, he kind of seems like he doesn't know what he's doing at times, but also does. It's the weirdest thing ever. But, you're the Laker fan. You could probably comment on that a little bit better than I.
I think he is a smart guy. It's just like, he probably needs somebody above him to kind of like, help it out. But okay. I don't think that's going to – I think Jeannie Buss, pretty much trusts him. And we'll see. We also had our WNBA preseason, Caitlin Clark debut.
Oh, yeah. So. Yeah, she went off. Or not went off, but, showed us some pretty unique skills. I think it's kind of wild to be drafted in a matter of, like, what, 3 weeks, couple of weeks, 3 weeks, and then – coming off the championship game to be drafted, and then now you're smack dab in preseason and pretty much doing some similar things that you did in college. So hats off to her. I think she's going to be amazing, and it's definitely brought a lot of attention to the Indiana Fever and the WNBA as a whole.
They were covering that like on the NBA halftime shows. I mean, like so that lets you know.
Yeah, generational. Yeah, generational talent right there.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. So once again, thank you everybody. For showing out to the live stream. Like I said, we may or may not have one tomorrow, and we will see you then.